An uneasy encounter. The Emberfield rest stop stood as a quiet oasis on a desolate stretch of highway, bathed in the warm glow of a setting sun. Its diner, a beacon of solace for weary travelers, was far from bustling. A few truckers, a family stopping for snacks, and a handful of strangers passing through. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale coffee and fried food, and the hum of old vending machines formed a steady backdrop. Marine Corporal Jack Morgan, recently back from his latest deployment, stepped through the glass door with a sigh. His eyes, trained to observe, swept across the small diner. A quick survey revealed nothing particularly out of the ordinary. Two truckers deep in conversation, a mother trying to coral her children, and the ever-present glow of fluorescent lights bouncing off plastic booths. Jack had seen it all before. Yet something about this place left a strange feeling crawling up his spine. He headed to the coffee counter, ordered his drink, and stood near the vending machines, letting his mind relax for the first time in days. His gaze floated toward the booths, scanning absently, until something caught his attention. In the far corner, sitting in one of the worn yellow booths, was a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with dark skin and curly hair framing her small face. She wore a bright pink dress that seemed out of place in the drab surroundings. Across from her, a middle-aged white man sat, his face obscured by a newspaper, occasionally stealing glances at the girl. The contrast between the two caught Jack's eye. He sipped his coffee, trying to shake off the sense of discomfort. Maybe she's adopted, he thought. Maybe he's her father or a relative. But it wasn't just the difference in appearance that caught his attention. It was the girl's demeanor. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting awkwardly in her lap, fingers twitching nervously. Her eyes darted around the room, never settling for long. She was tense. Too tense for someone just grabbing a bite to eat. Jack had seen that look before. It was the look of fear. His coffee turned cold in his hand as he watched the interaction unfold from a distance. The man would occasionally say something to the girl, and her response was barely a nod, her lips moving soundlessly. The unease gnawed at Jack's gut. Years of military service had sharpened his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was telling him that something was off. The girl's hand moved, barely noticeable, but it caught Jack's eye. She raised it slightly, palm outward, fingers spread wide, a gesture so small, so fleeting, that Jack almost missed it. His mind raced. Could that have been an SOS signal? He'd seen it used in high-pressure situations, a silent plea for help when speaking was too dangerous. He couldn't be sure. It could just be a nervous habit. But then her eyes met his. For just a split second, Jack saw something in them that made his heart pound. A silent, desperate plea for help. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but that one moment was enough to make him take notice. He moved closer, pretending to check out the snack options at the vending machine. The man seemed oblivious, engrossed in his newspaper, but the girl's tension was palpable. Her eyes shifted nervously again, scanning the diner as though searching for an escape. Jack's mind began to whirl with possibilities. Was this an abduction? A custody dispute? He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the girl's body language was screaming at him. As he stood there, debating his next move, the door to the diner swung open again, bringing with it a rush of cool evening air. A family of 4 entered, and for a moment, the man in the booth was distracted, glancing at the newcomers. The girl seized the opportunity, her hand twitching again, this time more pronounced. A deliberate, unmistakable SOS. Jack's pulse quickened. His training kicked in, mind and body snapping into focus. He wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. But how to approach? He needed to gather more information, confirm his suspicions without causing a scene. Approaching the girl directly might provoke the man if something truly was wrong, and Jack wasn't about to put her in more danger. He grabbed a bag of chips from the vending machine, his movements casual. He made his way toward the counter, positioning himself close enough to overhear the man and girl without appearing suspicious. The man's voice was low, too low for Jack to catch all the words, but the girl's body language told the story. Her small shoulders were hunched, her hands now gripping the edge of the table. The tension in her frame spoke volumes, and Jack felt the familiar surge of adrenaline coursing through him. This wasn't right. He turned back toward the counter, leaning on it as if waiting for something. His mind raced, trying to calculate his next move. He could try to engage the man, strike up casual conversation, and feel him out. Or he could approach the girl directly, offering her an out, though it was risky. The girl's eyes flicked up again, catching his once more. This time, Jack saw it clearly. Fear, pleading, desperation. There was no mistaking it now. Jack set his jaw, making the decision. He wasn't about to walk away from this. "Excuse me," he called out as he approached the table, his voice steady and calm. The man looked up from his newspaper, his expression unreadable but tense. The girl shrank back slightly, her fingers curling into the edge of the table. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone polite, but carrying an edge. Jack glanced down at the girl, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Everything okay here?" he asked, keeping his tone light. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the man. She nodded, but the movement was stiff, forced. "Of course," the man answered for her, his voice smooth. "We're just stopping for a bite to eat before hitting the road." Jack's instincts flared. There was something off in the man's tone, something too controlled. He wasn't going to let this slide. "Well," Jack said, his gaze locking on the man's, "if there's anything I can do, don't hesitate to ask." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the tension was palpable. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. The girl remained silent, her small frame still rigid with fear. Jack knew he couldn't walk away. Not yet. Something was wrong here, and he was going to find out what. As he backed away, his heart pounded with the weight of the decision before him. He couldn't leave this rest stop without knowing that the girl was safe. He had seen enough to know that this situation was far from normal, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to take action. Part 2 would take him deeper into the investigation, and Jack's training would be tested like never before. The thin veil of normalcy. Jack Morgan stepped away from the table, his mind racing but his exterior calm. He grabbed his coffee cup and returned to his spot near the vending machines, where he could keep an eye on the man and the girl without drawing too much attention. The eerie normalcy of the diner hummed around him. But Jack knew there was more going on beneath the surface. The man's response to his question had been too smooth, too polished, as though rehearsed. And the girl, her silence screamed louder than words ever could. Jack leaned against the wall, pretending to scroll through his phone, all the while keeping his gaze trained on the pair at the booth. His instincts were firing off in every direction, and he struggled to decipher the best way to act. He couldn't barge in, guns blazing, without knowing what he was dealing with. But he also couldn't shake the chill that had settled in his gut, the same feeling he got before things went sideways on the battlefield. The man shifted slightly in his seat, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. His gaze flicked toward the girl again, sharp and assessing. Jack caught the brief flash of impatience in the man's eyes, and it sent a surge of anger through him. He recognized that look. He'd seen it before in men who had power over someone weaker, and who relished that control. The girl, her small frame tense and motionless, barely seemed to breathe. Her hands were now clasped together on her lap, fingers knotted tightly as though holding herself together. Jack's eyes narrowed. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was terrified. Something snapped in him. He couldn't stand there pretending any longer. He needed to do something, but whatever he did, it had to be subtle enough not to provoke the man into anything rash. He considered his options. A direct confrontation could escalate quickly, and he couldn't risk putting the girl in more danger. But if he approached carefully, maybe he could coax the truth out without tipping the situation into chaos. As he pondered his next move, the door to the diner swung open again. A young couple walked in, chatting loudly, their laughter breaking the tense atmosphere in the room. The man glanced up at them briefly, and in that moment, Jack saw his chance. He moved toward the counter, placing his cup down and motioning to the waitress. "Hey, do you mind grabbing me a refill?" he asked casually. The waitress smiled, taking the cup from him. Jack turned and leaned on the counter, his body language relaxed, but his eyes fixed on the girl. She glanced up for a brief moment, and their eyes met once more. There was no doubt now. Her gaze was pleading, filled with the kind of desperation that made Jack's heart pound. She looked like someone who was silently screaming for help. He had to get her alone, away from the man. But how? The waitress returned with his coffee, and Jack tipped her generously before grabbing his cup and making his way back toward the vending machine. His eyes flicked back to the man and the girl, and an idea began to form. It wasn't foolproof, but it might give him the chance to find out more without alarming the man. He approached their table again, this time with a different tactic in mind. "Hey," Jack said, his tone friendly. "I was just thinking, I got some extra snacks in my car if you're hungry." He directed the offer toward the girl, keeping his voice light. The man looked up sharply, his expression neutral but his eyes darkening with suspicion. "We're fine," he said coolly. "We don't need anything." Jack didn't take his eyes off the girl, whose gaze flickered between him and the man. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The tension in her body was palpable, her small hands trembling slightly on the table. Ignoring the man's response, Jack smiled gently at the girl. "You sure? I've got some granola bars that are pretty good." He tilted his head, trying to catch her eye again. "You can come with me if you want, just for a minute. I'll show you where they are." The man's hand tightened around his coffee cup, his knuckles white. "I said, we're fine," he repeated, his voice steely. There was an edge to his tone now, barely restrained anger simmering beneath the surface. Jack's eyes flicked between the two. The man was losing his cool, and that was dangerous. Jack knew he had to back off, just for now. But he wasn't giving up. "All right, no problem," Jack said easily, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just thought I'd offer." He stepped away from the table, but not too far, hovering near the vending machines again. The man's eyes followed him for a moment before he turned his attention back to the girl. Leaning in to murmur something under his breath, Jack didn't need to hear the words to know they weren't kind. The girl flinched slightly, her shoulders hunching as though bracing for something. Jack's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He had to get her out of there. But how? As he stood there, trying to figure out his next move, a thought occurred to him. He pulled out his phone and, with a few quick taps, opened a text message to a buddy of his from the Marines, still active-duty military police. They had a code, something they used before in situations where they couldn't afford to draw attention. "Me. Need backup at Emberfield rest stop. Quiet approach. Potential situation." He hit send, hoping his friend was close enough to respond quickly. Jack wasn't going to take any chances. If this was what he thought it was, he'd need backup to handle it without causing a scene. The girl shifted again in her seat, her fingers brushing against her face. Another small, almost imperceptible gesture that Jack caught immediately. She was sending him a signal. He was sure of it now. The man leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing, though Jack still couldn't catch the words. Whatever he was saying, it was having the desired effect. Fear rippled through the girl's body, her shoulders trembling. Jack's pulse raced. He couldn't wait for backup. He had to act now, but he needed a way to do it without tipping the man off. If the guy panicked, things could go south quickly, and the last thing Jack wanted was for the girl to get hurt in the process. His mind raced through his options. He could create a distraction, something that would force the man to leave the table, even for a moment. But what? He glanced around the diner, his eyes falling on the payphone near the bathrooms at the back of the diner. That could work. Jack headed toward the phone, glancing over his shoulder to make sure the man wasn't watching too closely. He lifted the receiver and dialed the diner's landline, watching as the phone behind the counter began to ring. The waitress picked it up. "Hello, Emberfield Diner." Jack cleared his throat, disguising his voice slightly. "Hey, can you send someone to the back? There's a mess in the men's room that needs attention." The waitress sighed audibly. "Okay, I'll send someone." She hung up and headed toward the back, motioning to one of the other workers to keep an eye on things. It was a small distraction, but Jack hoped it would be enough to buy him a moment. As the waitress passed the man's table, she nodded toward him. "Sir, would you mind giving me a hand with something? Just for a moment." The man looked surprised, caught off guard. Sure. What's the problem?" "Something with the pipes in the men's room. Could use a second pair of hands." The man hesitated, glancing at the girl before nodding. "Stay here," he ordered her, his voice sharp. Then he rose and followed the waitress toward the back of the diner. The moment the man disappeared from sight, Jack made his move. He crossed the distance to the table in a few quick strides and knelt beside the girl, keeping his voice low. "Do you need help?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers. The girl hesitated, her lips trembling, before nodding ever so slightly. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly, her small hands still shaking. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. "Okay, stay calm," he whispered. "I'm going to get you out of here, but we need to be careful." The girl nodded again, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Jack glanced toward the back of the diner where the man had gone, his mind racing. He had only moments before the guy returned, and he needed to get the girl out before that happened. But how? As Jack prepared to act, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the diner, and the man's voice carried through the room. Time was running out. The moment of decision. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing through the otherwise quiet diner like the ticking of a bomb. Jack's pulse quickened as he crouched beside the girl, his mind racing through the possibilities. He was running out of time, and the man would be back any second. Every instinct in Jack's body was telling him to act, but he needed to be smart about it. One wrong move could put the girl in even more danger. The girl's wide, fearful eyes locked onto Jack's, pleading silently. Her small frame trembled, and he could feel the weight of her desperation. He had to get her out, and fast. "Stay close to me," Jack whispered, his voice low but firm. "When I say go, we're leaving. No matter what happens, don't look back." The girl nodded, her breath shallow, but her determination clear in her eyes. She wanted out. She needed out. Jack glanced toward the back of the diner, where the man was speaking to the waitress about some plumbing issue Jack had fabricated moments earlier. The distraction had bought him some time, but not much. He had maybe a minute, 2 at the most, before the man would return. Jack had to make sure they were gone before then. "Okay," Jack said, rising to his feet as casually as he could, hoping not to draw the attention of the few other diners. He reached out and took the girl's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Let's go." They moved swiftly but quietly toward the door. Jack led her past the tables, keeping his movements calm and steady, though inside, adrenaline surged through him like a rushing river. His senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body coiled, ready for action. As they neared the exit, Jack's gaze flicked to the reflection in the glass door. The man was walking back from the restroom, his eyes scanning the diner as he made his way toward the booth where he'd left the girl. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. They were seconds away from being discovered. "Come on," Jack whispered urgently, pushing the door open just wide enough for them to slip out without making a scene. The cool evening air hit them like a splash of water as they stepped outside. Jack kept a firm grip on the girl's hand, pulling her toward the parking lot. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the man coming after them. But for the moment, they were still in the clear. "Over here," Jack said, leading her toward his car, which was parked on the far side of the lot. His truck was nondescript, nothing flashy, which he hoped would help them avoid standing out. He quickly unlocked the door and ushered the girl inside, shutting it quietly behind her before moving around to the driver's side. Just as he climbed in and started the engine, Jack saw the diner's door fly open. The man stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock and fury as he scanned the parking lot, looking for the girl. His face twisted into a snarl as he spotted Jack's truck pulling away from the diner. Jack could see the man's hand move toward his pocket, and a sinking feeling settled in his gut. He had no idea what the man was reaching for. Could be a phone, but it could just as easily be a weapon. Jack hit the gas. The truck roared to life, speeding toward the exit of the rest stop. The tires squealed as they hit the pavement, and the girl let out a small gasp, clutching the edge of her seat. Jack kept his focus on the road ahead, but his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, watching for signs of pursuit. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, glancing over at her as they sped down the highway. The girl nodded, though she was clearly shaken. Her hands were still trembling, and she hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the diner. "You're safe now," Jack said gently, trying to reassure her. "No one's going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond, but Jack could see the tension in her body slowly begin to ease. She leaned back in the seat, her small hands still gripping the edges, but her breathing began to steady. They drove in silence for a few miles, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound in the cab. Jack's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had just happened. Who was that man, and why had the girl been so afraid of him? He had 1,000 questions, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. He needed to give her time. After a few more minutes, Jack pulled into a quiet rest area farther down the highway, well out of sight of the diner. He parked in a secluded corner of the lot, away from the other cars, and turned to face the girl. "Hey," he said softly. "I know this has been a lot, but I need you to tell me what's going on. Who was that man? Is he your—" "He's not my dad," she blurted out, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and something else. Relief, maybe. Jack couldn't be sure, but he could see how difficult it was for her to speak. "I don't know him." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He'd suspected something was wrong, but this was far worse than he'd imagined. "What do you mean you don't know him?" Jack asked, his voice steady, though inside, his heart was pounding. The girl swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. He took me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know where he was taking me. He said if I didn't do what he told me, he'd hurt me." Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel, anger surging through him. He forced himself to stay calm for the girl's sake, but inside, every part of him was ready to explode. He had seen enough in his years of service to recognize the signs of abuse, and what this man had done to this little girl, it made Jack sick. "Do you know where you're from? Where your family is?" Jack asked gently, trying to gather more information without pushing her too hard. The girl shook her head. "I don't know. I don't know where I am. He took me from a park. I was playing with my friends, and he grabbed me. I tried to scream, but he covered my mouth." Jack's stomach churned. This wasn't just a bad situation. It was a nightmare. "We're going to fix this," Jack said, his voice firm. "You're going to be okay. But we need to call the police. They'll help you, and we'll get you back to your family." The girl's eyes widened in panic. "No, please, no police," she begged, her voice trembling. "He said he'd find me if I told anyone. He said he'd hurt my family." Jack's heart broke for her, but he knew they couldn't handle this alone. Whoever this man was, he was dangerous, and the girl was in serious danger if they didn't act quickly. "Listen to me," Jack said, his tone gentle but firm. "I know you're scared, but the police can protect you. I won't let anything happen to you, I promise. But we need to call them so they can find this guy before he hurts anyone else." Tears spilled down the girl's cheeks, and she wiped them away with trembling hands. Jack gave her a moment, waiting for her to process what he was saying. He could see how scared she was, but she was also brave, braver than most kids her age would be in her situation. "Okay," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "Okay." Jack nodded, relieved that she was willing to trust him. He reached for his phone, dialing the emergency number and giving a quick report to the dispatcher, explaining the situation as best he could while keeping an eye on the girl. "We'll have officers en route to your location," the dispatcher said. "Stay where you are and keep the child safe. We're sending help." Jack hung up and turned to the girl, giving her a reassuring smile. "Help is on the way." But as they waited in the quiet of the parking lot, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, scanning the empty road behind them. The man from the diner. He wouldn't just give up that easily, would he? A creeping sense of unease settled over Jack as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The girl had escaped, but the real danger might still be lurking out there, waiting to strike again. The pursuit begins. The silence inside the truck was thick, broken only by the soft whirring of the engine and the distant hum of passing traffic. Jack gripped the steering wheel, his muscles taut, his senses hyper-focused. The girl, her name still a mystery to him, sat beside him, huddled against the seat, her eyes wide and filled with fear. Though they had escaped the diner, the looming presence of the man still hung over them like a dark cloud. Jack checked the rearview mirror again. Nothing. No sign of a car tailing them. Yet the gnawing feeling in his gut refused to subside. The girl's panic wasn't just from fear of being hurt. It was the terror of a child who had been threatened with something far worse. Jack had seen that kind of fear before, and it told him everything he needed to know. The man they'd left behind wasn't just some random predator. He was organized, and he wasn't going to let this go. "We're safe now, right?" the girl whispered, breaking the uneasy silence. Her voice was soft, trembling with uncertainty, and when Jack glanced at her, he saw the tear stains that still streaked her cheeks. Jack forced a smile, hoping it would reassure her, though he wasn't entirely sure they were out of danger. "We're getting there," he said, keeping his voice calm. "The police are on their way, and once they get here, everything's going to be okay." The girl nodded, though she still didn't look convinced. She kept glancing out the window, her small hands balled into fists in her lap, as if she expected the man to appear out of the shadows at any moment. Jack leaned back in his seat, trying to think. They were parked at a rest stop off the highway, but it wasn't exactly a place that made him feel safe. It was too isolated, too exposed. If the man really was following them, this would be an easy place for him to strike again. He pulled out his phone, checking the time. The dispatcher had said the police were on their way, but there was no telling how long it would take for them to arrive. And the last thing Jack wanted was to be caught off guard. "I need to know more," Jack said, turning to the girl. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a moment, then mumbled, "Tessa." Jack nodded. "Okay, Tessa. I know this is hard, but can you tell me what happened? How did you end up with that man?" Tessa's lip quivered, and for a moment Jack thought she wouldn't answer. But then she took a shaky breath and began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was at the park," she said. "It was a normal day. I was playing with my friends, and we were just running around. Then he came up to me. He said he knew my mom, that she was waiting for me, and he was supposed to take me to her." Jack's stomach tightened. He'd heard stories like this before, predators preying on a child's trust, using lies and manipulation to lure them away. It was a tactic as old as time, but hearing it from Tessa made it feel even more real. "I didn't believe him at first," Tessa continued, her eyes focused on the dashboard, as if the memory was too painful to look directly at. "But then he showed me something. It was a picture of my mom. He said she was in trouble, that she needed me." Jack's blood ran cold. The man had planned this. He'd known enough about Tessa to find a way to convince her to leave with him. This wasn't some random abduction. It was targeted. "And you went with him?" Jack said, more of a statement than a question. He could see the guilt and shame written across Tessa's face, though none of it was her fault. Tessa nodded. He took me to his car. I didn't want to go, but I thought I had to. Her voice cracked, and fresh tears welled up in her eyes. But then, when we got in the car, he started acting weird. He wasn't talking about my mom anymore. He was just driving. I tried to ask where we were going, but he wouldn't answer. Jack clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't let his anger cloud his judgment. Not now. He needed to stay calm, to think clearly. But everything Tessa was saying painted a picture of a man who was far more dangerous than Jack had initially realized. "How long were you with him before we saw you at the diner?" Jack asked, his voice low but steady. Tessa shrugged, looking confused. "I don't know. It felt like a long time. Maybe a few hours. He stopped at a couple of places, but I didn't know where we were. I wanted to run, but he told me if I tried, he'd hurt my mom." Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. This guy was a pro. He knew exactly how to manipulate a child's fear to keep them compliant. The way Tessa described the man reminded Jack of predators he'd encountered in his military service, the ones who operated in the shadows, who took what they wanted without ever revealing their true intentions. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the rest stop. His heart leaped into his throat as he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man from the diner. But it wasn't him. It was an old sedan, driven by an elderly couple who had stopped to stretch their legs. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. But the momentary relief didn't last. He knew they weren't out of danger yet. "Listen, Tessa," Jack said, turning to face her. "I need you to stay with me, okay? We're going to wait for the police. But if anything happens, if that man shows up, you have to do exactly what I tell you. No matter what." Tessa nodded, her wide eyes filled with fear. "Okay." Jack's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, that he hadn't given up. Jack knew men like him. Once they set their sights on something, they didn't stop until they got what they wanted. The hunter and the hunted. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, its dark ribbon winding through the night, illuminated only by the occasional passing car. Jack's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his pulse still pounding in his ears. The curve in the road had bought them precious time, but he knew it wasn't enough. The man who had taken Tessa was out there, and Jack had no illusions that the crash had stopped him for good. In the passenger seat, Tessa sat quietly, still shaken but trying to keep herself composed. The terror in her eyes had given way to a kind of grim resolve, but Jack could see the fatigue settling in. She was scared, and who could blame her? She had been yanked from everything she knew, trapped in the clutches of a man who had done God knows what to keep her silent and compliant. Now her only lifeline was Jack, a stranger she had only met hours ago, but one who had stepped up when no one else did. He glanced at her briefly. "You okay?" Tessa nodded, though she didn't speak. Her eyes were glued to the side window, as if expecting the dark shapes of trees to reveal some new horror. Jack couldn't blame her for the silence. She had already gone through more than any child should ever have to. But Jack knew the silence wouldn't last. The man would be back. Men like him didn't stop because of a crash or a minor setback. They had resources, connections, and more importantly, a burning need to finish what they'd started. Jack's phone vibrated, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. It was a call from his buddy, Joe, the military police officer he had texted earlier. "Hey," Jack said as he picked up the call, keeping one eye on the road. "Where are you?" "We're about 10 minutes out, coming in hot." Joe's voice came through the line, tense but steady. "I'm with a couple of local deputies. What's the situation?" Jack gave him a quick rundown, explaining the events from the diner to the near-deadly pursuit that had just unfolded. Joe listened in silence, occasionally interjecting with questions that showed just how serious he was taking the situation. "So the guy's still out there?" Joe asked, his tone darkening. "You're sure?" Jack nodded, even though Joe couldn't see him. "I'm sure. He went off the road, but I know his type. He'll be back. I can feel it." Joe cursed under his breath. "Stay on the highway. Keep moving, but don't head too far. We'll catch up, and when we do, we'll set up a perimeter. If he's still on the road, we'll box him in." "Got it," Jack said, glancing over at Tessa, who had begun to watch him with wide eyes, clearly trying to follow the conversation. "Hurry." "We're coming, Jack. Just hold tight." The call ended, and Jack tucked the phone away, returning his full attention to the road. His mind was racing, calculating the best route to buy them more time. He knew the clock was ticking. They had maybe 10 minutes before Joe and the deputies arrived, but in the world of pursuit, 10 minutes could be an eternity. Tessa's small voice broke the silence. Is he going to find us?" Jack kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. "Not if I can help it. We're going to be okay, Tessa. I promise." He wished he could believe his own words. He was trained to handle life or death situations, but this wasn't a war zone or a battlefield. This was something more insidious, a predator chasing his prey, and Jack was now caught between the hunter and the hunted. He couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, knowing that Tessa's safety was in his hands. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, bright and fast, tearing through the darkness. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. He knew it wasn't Joe and the cops. It was too soon. It had to be him. "Tessa, get down," Jack barked, his voice sharper than intended. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. He needed to stay focused. Tessa obeyed immediately, curling into the footwell of the truck, her small body shaking. Jack's hand clenched around the gearshift. The truck wasn't built for high-speed chases, and while he had the advantage of a head start, the vehicle behind them was gaining ground fast. The black SUV loomed larger in the mirror, its headlights cutting through the night like two predatory eyes. Jack's mind raced. He had to think fast. He needed a plan. The open highway wouldn't offer much in the way of cover, but maybe he could use the terrain to his advantage again. The road ahead stretched into more winding curves, with thick forest on either side. Jack made a split-second decision and veered off the highway, taking an exit toward a more rural, two-lane road that twisted through the dense woods. If he could lose the SUV in the trees, maybe he could buy them enough time for Joe to catch up. The SUV followed, its tires screeching as it tried to keep up. Jack floored the gas, pushing the truck to its limits as they careened down the narrow road. The trees closed in on either side, their dark branches whipping past like reaching hands. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed focused, scanning the road for any opportunity to throw off the pursuit. The road began to climb uphill, steep and uneven. Jack gritted his teeth, pushing the truck harder. He could hear the roar of the SUV's engine behind him, growing louder with every second. They reached the top of the hill, and Jack's eyes caught sight of something. A narrow, barely visible dirt road that branched off into the trees. It was risky, but it was his best shot. Without hesitating, Jack swerved onto the dirt road, the truck bouncing and jerking as it hit the uneven ground. The headlights of the SUV vanished momentarily as it struggled to follow. Jack held his breath, hoping the dense trees would provide enough cover to throw off their pursuer. But the SUV didn't give up. It barreled onto the dirt road, its tires kicking up dust and debris as it closed in on them. Jack cursed under his breath. This guy wasn't letting go. He was determined, relentless. "Tessa, hang on," Jack shouted as he steered the truck down the narrow path, dodging fallen branches and deep ruts in the road. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees so thick that the headlights barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead. Suddenly, the dirt road ended, opening into a small clearing. Jack slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a skidding halt. His heart pounded as he looked around, realizing they were trapped. The clearing was surrounded by trees on all sides, with no way forward. The SUV roared into the clearing behind them, its headlights blinding in the darkness. Jack could hear the engine rumbling as the vehicle slowed, blocking the only exit. The man had them cornered. Jack's mind raced. There was no time to think, no time to plan. This was it, the moment of confrontation. "Tessa, stay here," Jack said, his voice calm but urgent. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." Tessa's eyes filled with fear, but she nodded, her small hands fumbling with the door lock as Jack grabbed the handle and stepped out of the truck. The cold night air hit him like a wave as he stepped into the clearing, his eyes locked on the SUV. The engine cut off, and for a moment, there was only silence. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Jack could feel the weight of it pressing down on him as he waited, muscles tensed, ready for anything. The door of the SUV opened, and the man stepped out, his figure shadowed by the bright headlights. He moved with a calm, almost predatory confidence, his eyes fixed on Jack. He was tall, well-built, and the way he carried himself spoke of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. His training had prepared him for a lot of things, but nothing could have prepared him for this, a showdown in the middle of nowhere, with a child's life on the line. "You don't want to do this," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on the man. "Walk away now, and this doesn't have to end badly." The man's lips twisted into a cold smile. "She's mine," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with." Jack's jaw tightened. "She's not yours. She doesn't belong to you." The man's smile faded, replaced by something darker, something dangerous. "You think you can stop me?" he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You're just a washed-up soldier. You don't know who I am." Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let the fear show. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice low and deadly. "You're not getting her back." The man took a step forward, his hand slipping into his jacket. Jack's pulse quickened as he saw the glint of metal. The man had a weapon. "Don't do it," Jack warned, his voice tight with tension. He shifted his stance, ready to move. The man's eyes gleamed with malice as he pulled the gun from his jacket, pointing it directly at Jack. Time seemed to slow as Jack's mind raced. He had no weapon, no backup, and no cover. But he wasn't about to let this man take Tessa. He couldn't. In that split second, Jack made his move. With a burst of speed, Jack lunged to the side, dodging the first shot as it rang out, echoing through the clearing. He hit the ground and rolled, springing to his feet just as the man fired again, the bullet whizzing past his head. Jack's military training kicked in, his movements precise and fluid as he closed the distance between them. The man tried to aim for another shot, but Jack was faster, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it with a sharp, practiced motion. The gun clattered to the ground, and the man let out a roar of rage, swinging at Jack with his free hand. Jack ducked the blow, driving his knee into the man's gut with brutal force. The man doubled over, gasping for breath, but Jack didn't let up. He slammed the man to the ground, pinning him with one arm while his other hand searched for the discarded gun. The man struggled beneath him, thrashing wildly, but Jack's grip was unrelenting. Just as Jack's hand closed around the gun, the sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as Joe and the deputies closed in. The man froze, his eyes wide with fury and fear. "It's over," Jack said, his voice cold. "You're done." As the sirens grew closer, Jack knew that the nightmare was almost over. The aftermath of a hero's choice. The wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the clearing. Jack kept his knee pressed against the man's back, pinning him to the ground as the gravel beneath them dug into his own skin. The man's struggling head slowed, replaced by the heavy, labored breathing of someone who knew the chase was over. Jack could feel the anger simmering beneath the man's skin, the rage of a predator whose prey had slipped through his grasp. But it didn't matter anymore. It was over. Within moments, the police arrived. 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt, their doors flying open as officers spilled out, weapons drawn, their shouts cutting through the night. "Get your hands where we can see them. Now." Jack slowly raised his hands, signaling that he wasn't a threat. 2 deputies approached cautiously, one of them holstering his gun before moving in to cuff the man still pinned beneath Jack. The man barely resisted, though his eyes burned with hatred as they yanked him to his feet and forced his arms behind his back. Joe, Jack's old military buddy, stepped out of one of the cars, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before locking onto Jack. He crossed the distance quickly, his face a mix of relief and tension. "Damn, Jack," Joe muttered, shaking his head. "You really know how to pick your battles, don't you?" Jack managed a grim smile. Didn't have much of a choice. Joe's gaze shifted to the man, now being led away by 2 officers. "That the guy?" "Yeah," Jack said, his voice low. "He's dangerous, Joe. He had Tessa, threatened her, manipulated her, probably worse. I don't know how long she was with him, but we need to get her home. And fast." Joe's jaw clenched, and he nodded. "We'll take care of him. But what about the girl? Is she okay?" Jack glanced toward the truck, where Tessa was still huddled, watching the scene unfold through the window. Her small face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear. Jack's heart tightened at the sight of her. She was safe now, but the emotional scars of the ordeal were already setting in. "She's shaken, but she'll be okay," Jack said, his voice softening. "She's tough." Joe clapped Jack on the shoulder. "You did good, man. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Jack just nodded, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. He had acted on instinct, driven by the same need to protect that had guided him through years of service. But this felt different. This was more personal. The stakes had been higher. Joe motioned to one of the deputies. "Get a medic over here to check on the girl. And let's get a unit started on tracing her family." The deputy nodded and rushed off to make the calls. Joe turned back to Jack, his expression more serious now. "You want to go talk to her. She's probably pretty rattled, but you're the one she trusts right now." Jack didn't need the suggestion. He had already started toward the truck, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he approached. Tessa's eyes followed him, her tiny frame still trembling slightly as she watched him through the window. Jack pulled open the door and crouched down beside her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Hey," he said gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over now. You're safe." Tessa didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her eyes still wide, as though she was trying to process what had just happened. Jack could see the tears welling up again, and before he could say anything else, she launched herself into his arms, clinging to him with all the strength her small body could muster. Jack held her tightly, his heart aching for her. She had been through hell, and even though the immediate danger was gone, he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But in this moment, all that mattered was that she was safe. "It's okay," Jack murmured, stroking her hair as she buried her face in his shoulder. "You're going to be okay. No one's going to hurt you anymore." They stayed like that for a few moments, the chaos around them fading into the background. Jack could hear the distant voices of the officers, the low murmur of Joe giving orders. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was the girl in his arms, the child who had been so close to being lost forever. Eventually, Tessa pulled back, wiping her tear-streaked face with the sleeve of her jacket. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. "Thank you for saving me." Jack smiled softly, his heart swelling with pride for her bravery. "You're the one who saved yourself," he said gently. "You were strong, Tessa. You sent me that signal. You didn't give up, and that's what saved you." Tessa blinked up at him, as if trying to process the idea that she had played a part in her own rescue. But Jack could see it, the flicker of strength and determination in her eyes. She had been scared, yes, but she had also been courageous in a way that most kids her age couldn't have been. Before Jack could say anything else, one of the deputies approached, a kind-looking woman with a warm smile. "Hi, sweetheart," the deputy said, kneeling down so she was at eye level with Tessa. "My name's Officer Harper. I'm going to help you find your family, okay?" Tessa glanced at Jack, and when he nodded reassuringly, she gave the officer a small nod in return. Officer Harper smiled. "Good girl. We'll get you home soon, I promise." As Harper took Tessa by the hand and led her toward the waiting patrol car, Jack stood up, watching them go. A wave of exhaustion crashed over him, the adrenaline finally beginning to wear off. He rubbed a hand over his face, trying to shake the weight of it all, but the events of the night clung to him like a second skin. Joe walked up beside him, hands on his hips as he surveyed the scene. "You gonna be okay?" he asked quietly, his tone filled with the kind of understanding that only came from someone who had been through battles of their own. Jack nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure if it was true. "I'll be fine," he said after a moment. "Just didn't expect to get pulled into something like this. Not here. Not now." Joe sighed. "You did what you had to do, Jack. You saved her. That's what matters." Jack didn't respond right away. He just watched as Officer Harper helped Tessa into the back of the patrol car, her small form nearly disappearing in the large seat. He knew Joe was right. He had done what needed to be done. But the weight of it all still hung heavy on his shoulders. "What's going to happen to her now?" Jack asked quietly, his eyes still on Tessa. Joe crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. "Well, we'll run her name, figure out where she's from, and contact her family. Hopefully, they've been looking for her, and we can get her home. If not, well, there are resources. She'll be taken care of." Jack's jaw tightened. That guy, the one who took her, what happens to him? Joe's face darkened. "He's going away for a long time, Jack. We'll charge him with kidnapping, maybe more, depending on what we find. He's not going to hurt anyone else. Not after tonight." Jack nodded, though the answer didn't bring as much comfort as he'd hoped. There was a part of him that wanted to make sure the man never got the chance to hurt anyone again, to deliver justice with his own hands. But that wasn't his job anymore. It wasn't his place. He took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs before exhaling slowly. "Thanks, Joe," Jack said quietly. "For showing up when you did." Joe gave him a small smile. "Anytime, brother. You did good, real good." As the last of the police cars began to pull away, taking Tessa to safety and the man into custody, Jack felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion wash over him. The danger was over, but the emotional toll lingered. He knew that tonight would stay with him for a long time, and not just because of what he had done, but because of what he had seen in Tessa. She had been brave in the face of unimaginable fear, a reminder that strength didn't always come in the form of physical power. Sometimes strength was found in the quiet, desperate moments when hope seemed lost, but someone still found a way to reach out, to ask for help. Jack turned back to his truck, feeling the weight of the night settling into his bones. As he opened the door and climbed inside, the silence that greeted him was deafening. The adrenaline had faded completely, leaving only the heavy, aching quiet that followed a battle won. But Jack knew one thing for sure. Tonight, he had been in the right place at the right time. And because of that, Tessa had a chance at life, at recovery, at a future where she wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. As he pulled onto the highway, the distant lights of the police cars fading into the distance behind him, Jack allowed himself a small smile. Tessa would be okay. And for now, that was enough.